have a wonderful panel today, a set of 4 excellent papers. It's on political communication in an age of polarization and social media. We'll follow the order in the program. So that means that first up, we have activist mindsets in the spread of fake news from Michael Bank-Petersen and Mathias Osmundsen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Bank-Petersen, and as you can see, we have another title for the paper, and also we have added a co-author in Vin Arsino. What we're interested in here is the research question: why is it that some people are motivated to share what we call hostile political rumors? And what we understand as hostile political rumors are political information that portrays some group in a negative way and where the receiver does not really have any valid evidence of whether this is true or false. So this includes a whole lot of different things, such as fake news, conspiracy theories, but also just more regular negative campaigning. We think this is an important research question to study because the focus of past work has not focused on sharing why it is that people share these hostile political rumors, but have focused on why is it that people believe in them. But rumors, they take effect because they are shared. And also, we cannot get a complete understanding of why it is that people believe in hostile political rumors without looking into the sharing, because we know that one of the key mechanisms for generating rumor belief is prior exposure. Also, we know that lay people are in fact surprisingly motivated to share these hostile political rumors. There was a study recently out in Science that shows that a substantial amount of fake news are shared by humans rather than bots, and also that people share these fake news more and faster than they do real news. So what is it that actually drives them to do so? Even though that people within, for example, the political sciences have not looked deeply into this question, we know a lot about hostile rumor sharing in general in social psychology, where this suggests that hostile rumor sharing reflects attempts to mobilize against the target in the context of intergroup conflict. So this is also what we're presuming is going on in the context of sort of modern hostile political rumors. The particular question, though, that we will be looking into today is, well, who are people trying to mobilize against when they share a hostile political rumor? And if we look at the past work on beliefs, they suggest that beliefs in hostile political rumors are very much a function of partisanship. So if I'm a Democrat, then I believe in rumors that target the Republicans. If I'm a Republican, then I believe in rumors that target the Democrats, for example. So one straightforward application of that would be to say, well, maybe that is also what is going on when it comes to sharing. That's it. That is, if I'm a Democrat, then I'll share hostile political rumors about the Republicans and vice versa for the Republicans. We think, however, there's reason to pause when applying the insights on beliefs to sharing, because to believe is something different from sharing. So first of all, to believe is a private act, whereas to share is a public act. This means that there are potential social repercussions from sharing, which means that it requires stronger motivations. You need to hate the outgroup more intensely in order to share a hostile political rumor. And it's not clear that in the context of modern advanced democracies that the threshold for sharing, that the level of hatred is enough for people who are committed to mainstream actors within the political system, such as Democrats or Republicans. Also, if we look at the actual content of many hostile political rumors, then there are double-edged swords from a partisan perspective. They do target a specific political party, such as Pizzagate or the Birther Movement, but they also at the same time target the entire political system. That is, they suggest that there's something wrong with the system as such. Therefore, what we are focusing on here in this particular project is that sharing motivations reflect what we call chaotic motivations. That is, that they are trying to mobilize against the entire political cosmos rather than partisan goals. That is, they're not trying to help one mainstream actor within the system. They're trying to tear down the system as such. So we're assessing this in a wide variety of ways with a lot of different samples, and I'll show you some of the data that we have from these samples. In all of these samples, we presented subjects with headlines that contained a hostile political rumor targeting several groups. So in a sample in Denmark, it was left and right-wing groups. We also have a sample of non-Western immigrants which focus on Muslims and Danes, and then in the American samples, we focus on Democrats and Republicans. And we asked 2 questions. First, do you think this story is true? And also, would you share this story on a social media platform such as Twitter or Facebook? So the kinds of hostile political rumors that we are using are these. Here we have one example from the Danish survey, saying a secret network of right-wing party members, business people, and police officers have organized systematic violence against political opponents from the left wing. This is not something we have come up with. We have ventured into the dark corners of the internet, and this is a circulating rumor in Denmark. Or in the non-Western immigrant sample, we ask or present people with a story about leaders of mosque pressure young Muslims to commit burglaries to get money for jihad, also a real rumor. Here in the United States, for example, we ask, do you believe and would you share the story that Hillary Clinton approved a deal to transfer US uranium deposits to a Russian company for donations to the Clinton Foundation? So we want to start out with making this distinction between chaotic and partisan motivations. And the first way in which we do it is to look at how it is that political activism within and outside the system influence sharing motivations. So from the literature on political radicalization, we get 2 measures. First of all, individual differences in so-called legal political activism and individual differences in violent political activism. That is political activism that is sort of targeting the system as such. We also directly measuring partisan motivations, so social identification with the target group, such as the Democrats or whatnot, or social identification with the group opposed to the target. So if we start by looking at what are the effects of this distinction between legal activism and violent activism. So first we can look at motivations to believe in the American sample. And what we can see is that there's no effect of legal activism on willingness or motivation to believe, but there's a substantial effect of violent activism. And even more so when it turns to motivations to share, violent activism is driving a lot of this. And the X or the y-axis should be interpreted as effect sizes. All of the results that I'll be presenting should be interpreted in that way. We're seeing the same effects in both Denmark and among non-Western immigrants. So basically, motivations to share are related to violent activism that targets the system as such. So is there a role for partisan motivations in this? And the basic answer is no. And I don't have time to really dig deep into the data, so I'll just give you a brief overview. So across the samples, these violent activists, they share hostile political rumors independently of the target of the rumor and independently of whether they identify with the target or not. Non-violent partisans, on the other hand, do not share any hostile political rumors. So it seems that those who are violent activists are those who share, and what they do is that they share promiscuously. Whatever seems disruptive, they share. Why is it that they do so? Well, the first thing we looked at is, if I'm a violent Democrat, do I share stories about the Democrats in order to defend the Democrats, to say, hey, look what they're saying, what the Republicans are saying about us, we need to mobilize to defend the group. In order to test that, we implemented a module in our sample 4, an MTurk sample, where we presented people with hostile political rumors and then say, well, why do you want to share this particular rumor? And then we asked, is it to defend the target? And unsurprisingly, participants who identify with the target are more likely to share, to defend, to report that defense motivation. However, this is qualified by a negative interaction with violent activism, and here you can see the marginal effects of identification across levels of violent activism, which shows that when you are high in violent activism, your party identification no longer matters. So these people do not share particularly to defend their in-group. Then we more sort of openly ask, well, why do you share? And specifically we asked in this sample 4 again about 4 things. Do you do it to mobilize against disliked group? Do you do it to amuse the audience? Do you do it because it's true, what the story is about? Or do you do it because it's big if true? It has large consequences if it's true. And here's what we're finding, that violent activists, they share to mobilize. They do think it's kind of funny, but they do not care about whether it's true. In fact, they are more attracted to stories that they think are false. So how should we think of this sort of psychological syndrome that says, well, I'll share anything that mobilizes people against groups that are like. I don't care about the truth value, and I think it's kind of funny. Well, we have had some inspiration in the popular culture, namely the movie The Dark Knight. And in that movie, there is a particular scene where Alfred the butler is trying to explain what is the psychological motivations of the Joker. And what he's saying is that, well, some men aren't looking for anything logical. They can't be bored, bullied, reasoned, or negotiate with. Some men just want to watch the world burn. And we think this is a psychological syndrome that sort of explains what we're seeing here, but we want to see if we can actually measure that kind of individual difference to watch the world burn in surveys. So what we do is that we bring you the need for chaos scale. You have had the need for cognition, need to evaluate, and so on, but we have here a suggestion for another type of psychological need. And specifically, it is an 8-item individual difference measure with some pretty nasty statements, such as, when I think about our political and social institutions, I cannot help think, just let them all burn. We cannot fix the problems in our social institutions. We need to tear them down and start over. And we have implemented this measure in the 3 US samples, and it's highly reliable. So does the sharing of hostile political rumors reflect this need for chaos? Well, it does. First of all, need for chaos is strongly related to motivations to share hostile political rumors across the samples, and also it accounts for around 50 to 60% of the association that we saw earlier between violent activism and sharing motivations. So basically we have this need for chaos, which simultaneously shapes violent activism and sharing motivations. So are these effects of need for chaos robust? We have done a lot to try to document that. So the just reported associations are robust to exclusion of observations due to so-called survey trolling, response sets, and outliers. And also we control for a number of potential confounds in the form of populism and political cynicism, measures of other psychological needs, the dark triad personality trait, which is that you are a nasty person in general, in multiple ways, and also motivation to share non-hostile political rumors. But the effect is robust against all these different robustness checks. So who needs chaos? Who are these people who want to tear down society? Well, sort of if we look into the term chaos and what motivates us to call this trait need for chaos is that chaos comes from Greek mythology and refers to the original state of things from which order is produced. So one way to think of a need for chaos is that it's a longing for a new beginning or a clean slate. And those who are motivated, or those who stand to gain from a new beginning, are those without stakes in the present status hierarchy. So the way we think about need for chaos is that it's a strategy of last resort by marginalized status seekers. And there's some evidence in the sort of wider behavioral science literature on this. So for example, status seeking is a key predictor of participation in violence. Desire for recognition is a cross-cultural predictor of the phenomenon of running amok across cultures. And also that uncertainty about the self-social standing predicts identification with radicalized groups in Western societies. So what we did was we implemented a number of measures of status-seeking motivations and actual status in one of the surveys, an empiric study. And we first look at measures of status-seeking motivations, and need for chaos is indeed highly related to so-called status-driven risk-taking, and it's highly related to social dominance orientation, both measures of status-seeking motivations. But while these people are very high in status-seeking motivations, when we look at measures of actual status, they are lower. So they have a lower placement, self-perceived placement on the social ladder scale, and they feel more lonely. So need for chaos people are frustrated status seekers that as a consequence say, let's just tear it all down. So to sum up, what we are arguing is that motivations to share hostile political rumors reflect a need for chaos, not partisan motivations. This is not to help one mainstream actor within the system against another. It is to tear down this system as such. As a consequence of that, we can also say that the current phenomenon of fake news and so on that we are seeing is not a problem, it's not a disease in itself, it's a symptom of something we can think of as much worse. Because what we are finding is that status-obsessed yet marginalized individuals seek to mobilize against this entire established cosmos. And this goes against, for example, the assumptions that's built into the fact-checking industry, because what we're showing is that those who share hostile political rumors, they do actually not care about the truth. Also, it goes against the assumptions in some of the literature on cyberbullying, which say, well, trolls just want to have fun. But this is not the case. Cyberbullying, sharing of fake news, is a very instrumental act with a particular political goal of destabilizing the democratic system. What is most worrisome is that this need for chaos is surprisingly widespread. So 40% of Americans in the representative YouGov sample fail to disagree with the statement, when I think about our political and social institutions, I cannot help think, just let them all burn. And with that, I want to say thank you for your attention.
Hi, I'm Levy. I'm really grateful for the last presentation, not least because I finally understand my mother-in-law. I'm not sure this one will be quite as illuminating, but before I start, I'd just like to apologize for a bait and switch. Dennis and I are also working on a project that kind of looks at the other end of the spectrum of influence on public opinion, the influence of nonpartisan experts, where you might expect information to sway public opinion. Here we're substituting a paper that's a little further along that is far to the other side, where we're going to look at whether the mere say-so of little-known representatives can actually influence, that alone in isolation can influence the opinions of their constituents. Just some background on this. We know that opinion leadership is pervasive in democracies. Elites have a lot of tools at their disposal to shape public opinion. They can deploy party cues, they can secure the endorsements of interest groups in favor of the issue positions that they advocate, and they can make arguments that frame issues in terms that are congenial to the positions they'd like their constituents to take. So we know that strictly bottom-up models of democracy need a lot of modification. In many cases, democracy works in the opposite way. There's a lot of top-down influence. What we're interested in is probing the limits and scope of that influence. And so in one view, we think that you could see opinion leadership as the latitude is quite broad, but also quite limited. If elites need to make arguments in favor of their positions, get the party behind their positions, and secure interest group endorsements, there are limits to the kinds of issue positions they could get their constituents to take. We see that as more the traditional view. More recently, we think that we see kind of an increase in attention to the idea that opinion leadership may rest on a foundation of much more blind following. That is, that the public is more pliable than we may have thought. And so Gabe Lenz, for example, finds that people will adopt the positions of the political leaders that they like, almost irrespective of their awareness of those leaders' ideology. Even more strikingly, I think David Brockman and Dan Butler find, using an innovative field experiment, that just sending a letter from a little-known state representative to constituents staking out a position is enough to move public opinion in the direction of that opinion. And leaders seem to face very little blowback also for staking out positions that are unpopular. We see some empirical challenges to sorting out the impact of just knowing your leader's position. Positions are rarely articulated without arguments or party cues or interest group endorsements. Usually something comes along with just staking out a position. In the context of David and Dan's field experiment, we don't know what happened after the treatment was delivered. People may have had their attention drawn to a particular political issue and then sought out more information that mediated the effect of the position taking. So it may have been that they then found out which parties aligned on which side of the issue, and that actually did the work in swaying opinions. Our research questions are first and foremost whether, in fact, citizens do blindly adopt the positions that their leaders take, in the sense that they learn which positions their elected representatives take, even if they know little about the representative and have nothing else, no other information to go on. Do they conform their opinions to those staked out by their leaders? And then we'd like to know how that effect, to the extent that it exists, varies with the context of information in which they learn about their leaders' positions. We have a few hypotheses. The first, we take the side, we were uncertain going into the research, is the motivation for the research. We hypothesize that there will be some what we call position adoption effect. And our bases for assuming this are varied. People have referred in prior literature to even things as far afield as the tendency to obey authority, in kind of the Milgram experiment view that if people perceive the representative as a legitimate authority, they might conform to the view. There may also be bandwagon effects in the sense that if people assume that the representative is taking a position, it's probably backed by the majority, and therefore they will adopt that position as well. And blind conformity. People also may, as in a kind of pure trustee model of representation, infer that the elected representative has some kind of prestige or trustworthiness or expertise, and that also might give the mere position-taking cue value. On the other hand, we had some skepticism about how large this effect would be. It's a pretty weak treatment to just tell people, here's some person you've probably never heard of, but he is or she is your elected representative. Here's the opinion, nothing else. See if you'll change your mind. As far as how this position adoption effect, to the extent it exists, would vary with context, we thought that it just intuitively, if we bolstered the representative's reputation by giving positive biographical information about the representative, that would increase the extent to which citizens blindly adopt their representative's position. We also expected that the effect would be more pronounced when people had little else to go on in forming an opinion. So less sophisticated, less politically aware voters might be more inclined to blindly conform to their leaders' positions. And in a similar spirit, we expected that if we gave people fewer other cues to work with, they would be more likely to adopt their leaders' unadorned positions. We investigated this effect across 4 surveys. 3 were in Los Angeles Times live interview telephone polls of California registered voters. And we followed up with one MTurk survey. I'll give you some details about the differences between those surveys as we proceed. But there was an essential similarity to all of them. The treatment that we were most interested in was the effect of simply telling people where their state representative had come down on an issue and observing whether post-treatment we could see a difference between those who had been so informed and the opinions of those who had not, and whether people moved in the direction of their representatives. Tell you a little bit about our studies. They encompassed a range of different political issues, and they also included a variety of additional treatments. So our first study gave some respondents not only the position-taking cue, but also a brief biography of the representative, and others a brief justification for the position. This was in a sense designed in a way that mimics David Brockman and Dan Butler's field experiment, in which the treatment letters had, all the letters had this information included. Our second study included a broader array of additional treatments. We wanted to see how position adoption would fare when it was pitted against or in addition to a party cue, competing interest group endorsements, and opposing arguments. And our third study was on bilingual education, and we not only gave the position-taking cue, but then for some respondents pitted it against a brief counter-argument. And our fourth study, just to get into the differences, was meant to stack the deck in favor of finding a position-taking effect, position adoption effect. We took an arcane issue, who should manage the air traffic control system, something we expected citizens to have very little strong opinion about, a nonprofit corporation or the government. And in addition to position-taking cues, we gave some respondents a party cue and arguments, either arguments that were roughly balanced in strength, or arguments that were, we thought, lopsided in favor of privatizing the air traffic control. To just give you a sense of these treatments, This is what a position-taking queue looks like in our experiments. It is, I want to emphasize, just bare-bones information. This is your representative in the California State Senate or in our third study in the Assembly, and this is a position that he or she took on this issue. That's it. As far as our other treatments, these are examples of the biographical treatments which were culled from the websites of state legislators. You can see that actually if you're paying close attention, they contain quite a bit of information. Information that might speak to competence, information that speaks to background or particular concerns. If you read closely enough, you might even see a partisan queue in 2 of these bios, which are for legislators in the Northeast Los Angeles County area. These were our party cues from, very simple and straightforward, from our second study. Jerry Brown opposed one of the issues we used and supported the other. We expected that to be a stronger cue because it gave the partisan alignment on the issue, or sensed the partisan alignments on the issue. This is a sample of our interest group endorsements, where we have one interest group on one side of the issue versus another. And here are examples of the opposing arguments that we gave, which were meant to kind of orient the issue ideologically. So you have on one side kind of an argument about public health, but on the other side there's sort of a freedom of choice argument that we expected would be appealing to conservatives when it comes to the issue of where to set the minimum age for smoking. As far as our key measures, we were interested in the first 3 studies in the degree of convergence between respondents and legislators, whether they agreed, disagreed, or whether the respondent was not sure. And in the MTurk study, because the positions were all made up that we gave people, we just look at opposition and support in response to getting a supportive position-taking cue or an opposing position-taking cue. And for knowledge and sophistication, we measured that in several different ways across the surveys, self-reported political interest or a knowledge quiz. It didn't wind up making all that much difference as far as our results go. Let me quickly summarize our results from the first 3 LA Times studies. Pooling across all the treatment conditions that we included in these experiments, we see very little evidence that the position-taking cue in itself increase the convergence between legislators' opinions and those of their constituents. The point estimates in our experiments all hover around 0, and while none of the experiments in and of itself is sufficiently powered to rule out some modest effect, we think that the 3 of them put together provide pretty strong evidence that in the context, at least, of experiments like these, you don't have much blind conformity to the position of the state representative. Our other expectations were also disconfirmed. We didn't see any particular heterogeneity by voter sophistication. We didn't see any evidence that position adoption increased when people had less to go on in the sense of party cue, the absence of party cues, interest group endorsements and arguments. And we also didn't see that boosting or attempting to boost the legislator's reputation using the biographical treatments made much difference in the degree to which people blindly conformed to the legislator's position. On the other hand, some of our other treatments did matter, not all, but some. In our second study in particular, we saw that the party cues were influential on one issue. Opposing arguments did tend to polarize the public on the issue of the minimum age for smoking, moving Republicans to oppose setting that limit, and Democrats pretty much unaffected. We followed up in the MTurk study to kind of give the position adoption effect the best shot. We put the treatment right before the dependent variable. And as I said, we chose an arcane issue. We also, in that experiment, noted to the respondents that their state legislator had made this kind of a signature issue in the campaign, been on a commission that was looking into this issue. Try to ratchet up the expertise of the state legislator and maybe increase conformity to his or her view. But in fact, our hypothesis was frustrated. Once again, we found little evidence that the people who were told their legislators' position differed post-treatment in their opinions about whether to privatize the air traffic control system from those who were not told. On the other hand, in that experiment, we did find that our other treatments moved opinion in pretty intuitive ways. The party cues that we gave polarized opinion. The unbalanced information treatment increased support for privatizing the air traffic control system, and the balanced information then restored more or less the pre-treatment distribution of opinion. So in sum, we don't see really any evidence in these experiments, at least, for a position adoption effect, even in cases where we might expect it, among less sophisticated voters in the absence of other information about the issues on issues that are pretty arcane, and right after giving positive biographical opinion about the legislator. We just don't really see it anywhere. On the other hand, other cues did influence opinion in the ways that previous research has shown that they often do. So it's not that opinions on these issues were simply unmovable. In a way, you could see the result as maybe kind of averting a worst-case scenario for opinion leadership. The public may be quite pliable and persuadable, but it may not be quite as pliable as previous research has suggested, at least in framing its results. And so I guess what you could say is when it comes to democracy, there's a lot to get down in the mouth about, but now we can just remember it could be worse. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. So this is an ongoing project that seeks to explore why messages so often fail to resonate with listeners. And we hope to posit some avenues and strategies the researchers could use to craft messages that could persuade people. So, so there are many different ways to define frames within the political communication literature, but one of the common themes is that these are messages that provides receivers with a way of understanding a particular issue by connecting that core construct with certain associations that lead people to rely more heavily on certain considerations than others when formulating their opinion. And this works by making certain associations perceived as more relevant, more cognitively salient, more accessible, when they draw upon them in long-term memory. So the problem is that frequently these frames that we construct have moderate or even null effects. And we suspect that motivated reasoning could help explain why persuasion is so difficult in the political communication literature. In particular, we believe that people, upon mere exposure to an object they're asked to evaluate, are drawing upon attitudinally congruent associations that overwhelm the messages that they're receiving. Okay? So our sample is drawn from Amazon Mechanical Turk, and because we suspect prior attitude to play an important role in this story, we employed a quota system to construct a sample with approximately similar numbers of subjects on the basis of prior attitude and strength of attitude on oil drilling off the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so we have approximately similar numbers of people who oppose, support, and are undecided on this issue, as well as people who have very strong opinions versus somewhat weak opinions. And after getting this sample, we expose subjects to frames drawn from Druckmann, Chong, and Slothos' study examining counterframes, where they expose a message that is supportive of oil drilling, provides an argument in favor, one opposed to oil drilling, both frames with randomized order. And we also have a condition where subjects are given no message at all. Okay? So our key measure for implementing a network approach to the study of framing effects is through the triadic decision task. So subjects are presented with oil drilling after the exposure to the frame, and they're just asked, what are the first 3 concepts that come to your mind when you think about oil drilling? So we refer to these as the first level or tier 1 associations. So someone might say spills, energy, environment. Then these first level associations are fed into subsequent questions where subjects are asked, what are the 3 concepts that come to mind when you think about spills, for the first example. And these form our tier 2 associations. Okay? This method provides us with the content and the structure for these networks. The content being drawn from the substance of the associations that are reported. So what people are saying are the ideas that are coming to mind. And the relationship between the first and the second level association provides us with the proximity data that we use to structure these networks and essentially how these semantic constructs relate to each other within our sample. Okay? So with these sorts of examples, the concepts that are more central within the networks, they're going to be more cognitively accessible to the group. So they come to mind more quickly than concepts that are further on the periphery. Okay? We also asked for each association that was reported how people feel about that concept. More positive, which is the blue, more negative, which is the red, or more neutral, which is going to be reflected as yellow within these graphs. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about the structural relationships that emerged from our analyses. So on the top here, we see individuals with, who are supportive of oil drilling. And on the bottom, we see our groups with attitudes that are opposed to oil drilling. And when we compare the people who entered into our study with prior attitudes on this issue to those who were undecided, we can see that their cognitive networks, how they were structuring their ideas about this issue, are much more constrained. They're denser networks when compared to the undecided neutral people on average. This effect was largely driven by those with the strongest attitudes. So here we can compare the undecided neutral people on the issue to those with weak attitudes, and their network structures were very similar. The people with weak attitudes were slightly more constrained, had slightly denser networks, but they looked pretty similar to those that were undecided. What was really drawing the effect for prior attitudes were those who felt very strongly about this issue. They exhibited very large-scale, broad networks, large diameter, as they were drawing in more particularistic associations. And these networks also featured a very dense, highly constrained core of cognitive semantic associations, reflecting very similar ideas that were easily accessible to this population. We also looked at the effect of frame condition on the types of network structures that emerged from our data. So we compared those who were exposed to the single frames, the pro-oil drilling frame, the anti-oil drilling frame, to those who were exposed to both frames, and those who were just asked to tell us their thoughts through the triadic decision task. They were not given a message. And what we found was that regardless of the frame that people were exposed to, they exhibited fairly similar constraint, okay, in their networks. There is some suggestive evidence, though not statistically significant, that amongst the neutral subjects, so those who were undecided on the issue, exposing them to the counterframe, where they heard both sides, did lead them to draw in more diverse associations and sort of to break up, diffuse their lines of thought on this issue. But again, that's not a statistically significant difference. Perhaps with stronger arguments, we'd see a stronger relationship there. But the cognitive structure is only half the story here. We also examined the role of the affective charge, the online tally of the associations people were bringing in. And what we found is that people with pro-oil drilling attitudes were drawing overwhelmingly upon associations that were positively, affectively charged, that they felt good about. Individuals who were opposed to oil drilling, they were drawing on ideas, thinking of things that made them, feel very negative. Okay, so congruent with their pre-existing attitude on this central issue of oil drilling. Whereas those who were neutral had more of a balance in the affect of the associations they were drawing upon. So here we see the dominance of prior affect in how people are thinking about these issues on mere exposure. And again, these effects are strongest among those with the strongest attitudes. So amongst the neutral, we have a fair balance. Once someone has a weak pre-existing attitude, we see the differences in affect content begin to emerge. And among those with strong attitudes, it's overwhelmingly affectively congruent with their attitudes on oil drilling. Okay? We also examined the effect of frame condition here, comparing the single frame, both pro and anti, with the counterframe and the control group who did not receive a frame. And we found that the effect of prior attitude overwhelmed the effect of the frame, no matter what framing condition people were in, and whether they received a message or not. There's, once again, we see some suggestive evidence that people with very weak attitudes who are exposed to the counterframe condition may be tempted to think more broadly on the issue. We also see some suggestive evidence of a possible backlash effect. So what do I mean by that? Well, individuals with strong, supportive attitudes on oil drilling who were not given a message, they had a large dominance of positive associations come to mind, which is consistent with their prior attitudes. But they had a non-negligible number of counter considerations, negative associations on oil drilling. So they weren't just thinking positive thoughts, and they had a scattering of neutral. Those who were exposed to the anti-frame, so the message that they didn't like, that was incongruent with their prior attitude, we see the number of negative associations dip and the number of neutral associations increase. So there may be some effect here consistent with motivated reasoning where people are recruiting associations, ideas, thoughts that are a little more consistent with their prior attitude when they hear messages they don't like. Okay? We also examined subnetworks within these conditions, and we call these communities. They're essentially clusters of nodes, clusters of concepts that are more closely related to each other than the overall connectivity of the network. So we can think of these as concepts, ideas that are closely related. Okay. So here we see the control conditions with our undecided neutral folks, those with weak attitudes, and those with strong pre-existing attitudes. And what we find is that those with the strongest attitudes have the most overlap in their communities. Essentially, that means that activating one particular concept, it's very easy to activate the whole range of concepts. So people go from one idea to another. And this fits with the sort of motivated reasoning where individuals can crawl through these associations and easily find the sort of concepts that will support the argument that they want to make. Whereas those with weaker attitudes, their thoughts on this issue are more diffuse. There are more isolated lines of thought. And this is most pronounced among individuals who are undecided and neutral on this issue. And we think that looking at communities is an excellent, or could be an excellent way of extracting conceptual themes in a sort of grounded theory approach to open-ended data. So this is one of my favorites. Amongst the neutral individuals, one cluster that emerged included words like dawn, oily, wash, duck, soap. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So this seemed to have a somewhat ironic effect of making people feel less worried about oil drilling because, you know, Dawn soap was going to come in and save the day by cleaning up the animals. We also think that this can be used in a prospective manner in helping researchers to craft messages that will have a more consistently reliable effect on their population of interest. So by identifying particular discrete communities and looking at the semantic language, the concepts that are within these closely cognitively associated subnetworks, a researcher may be able to extract this language and use it as the basis for a vignette or a frame or some other message that they want to relay. So amongst our neutral control group, language such as emphasizing the controversy surrounding oil drilling, the potential for fracking, earthquakes, disruption, destruction, we would expect that that kind of language may make them opponents of oil drilling. Okay? Now there are some limitations and challenges with this present study. There's a lot of data, and so it takes a lot of time to make substantive comparisons regarding the content of these different groups. We also were unfortunately unable to recover sufficient variation in political sophistication and interest. We were hoping to be able to speak to some of Converse's, or more broadly, Converse's thoughts on differences in citizen competence regarding the constraint of these sorts of belief systems. Despite the fact using frames that have been successfully persuasive in previous research, our subjects were not really moved by these frames. They didn't really seem fazed by the arguments that we gave them. And because of that, we weren't able to really make determinations on some important causal effects that could be at play upon exposure to these frames. So we'd love to hear if that's something that's worth following up on or not. But a couple important takeaways we feel from this research is that in political communication and information, frequently the focus is on logical consistency, how factually coherent are the ideas and thoughts that subjects are bringing up. This sort of research suggests that it may be prudent to look at how affectively congruent are the ideas that people are bringing up. Perhaps an emotional consistency and coherence could be the key to understanding how to speak to the hearts of publics of interest. We also see this approach as having a lot of potential for streamlining focus groups in a way that's able to capture the complexity of open responded in those sorts of environments at a fraction of the cost. This sort of procedure only takes about 10 minutes to get a considerable sample size, and you're able to adjust the depth that you want to go to by adjusting the number of tiers in the triadic decision task. It introduces some robust quantitative analyses to this complex data that allow researchers to build their grounded theory as well as craft strategic messages. Thank you so much.
All right, so this project in some ways kind of combines the first and the third in that it's kind of on the chaotic evil side of things. Sorry, don't mean to give away the D&D origins that clearly underlie your system here. And sort of different ways of modeling and thinking about sort of complex opinion data. We actually have another project on conceptual networks with another graduate student of mine. This one is sort of a spatial approach. And basically the idea is we're trying to understand sort of extreme hate and sort of its origins and what happens to it as it sort of evolves here. So this is joint work with Anna and Spencer. I do have a content warning here. There is going to be no particularly bad text, but there's lots of bad words, and it turns out enough bad words actually requires a warning. So FYI on that, you'll see. All right, so this is sort of a project that's using social media data, and there's kind of two ways of coming at what we're interested in. One is kind of from the perspective of social media itself, which is kind of an interesting topic in its own right. So we used to have this sort of nice optimistic view of the powers of social media to sort of advance democracy and information. This is from a picture from an essay by Clay Shirky that was sort of the height of the optimism in 2011, maybe before it started declining. And now the new view is a bit more pessimistic with paper after paper at this conference and others about the drawbacks of these sorts of things. And there are lots of papers on fake news that I've been seeing. There are worse things than fake news. So the torch has changed. I tried to find one where somebody's holding the torch and looking at the phone, but the best I could do was I think Nazi number 3 here is looking at his phone behind the thing. And of course, this is ongoing. This is from the front page of the Times today, a march in Eastern Germany that's neo-Nazis, and you can see the sort of the role of the phone there also. So, it's reaching far beyond social media. And so within the framework of social media itself, not as it extends outwards, but just within there, there are worse things than fake news. Here are a couple of sort of our motivating examples. I think the way particularly Spencer and Awana were thinking about these things is, and actually, Twitter and Facebook have been having various public meetings about sort of how to talk about the worst sort of hate on their platforms, and they've been framing it increasingly in terms of dehumanization and animalistic language, even more than, say, using extreme profanity like the N-word or whatever. So here's sort of two recent examples, and one of the things we're kind of thinking about is, how did these people become so terrible? What we're not trying to do is do the entire trajectory from starting out as an innocent child and ending up as a terrible person, but rather sort of focusing kind of on the apex of this trajectory, that is, how do they sort of move from being sort of generically bigoted into being terrible racists, and then possibly how do they move out of it? And this is sort of a preliminary project, and a lot of what we're doing here is really not causal so much as descriptive, but there's a lot to be done on the descriptive side of things. More generally, sort of backing away from the social media question, we're sort of interested in these questions of, how do we explain virulent racism and how people get there? And the drawbacks are that sort of existing survey measures are kind of inadequate to this in a lot of ways. One, it's very hard to create a survey that like surveys people over and over and over again as they're sort of evolving in their opinion. And two, there are sort of drawbacks to surveys' attempts to measure racism in various ways that I'm sure many of you are aware of. You know, the ANES has like these 5 questions that just sort of turn up in various forms year after year after year. And most of these are sort of measures of a milder cultural racism. So we distinguish sort of milder cultural racism, which would be something like, you know, if they just worked harder, they would do better. You know, African Americans have a culture of laziness, whatever. These sort of things that are not really using, you know, dehumanizing language or even particularly bad terminology, but are still sort of within the frame of attitudes sort of that are bigoted against black people and other groups. So recently there have been lots of advances in like trying to measure these sorts of things. The implicit association test is one of those. The drawback from our point of view is it's really best at sort of measuring sort of the finest grains, the mildest of degrees of racism rather than the most extreme versions of things. You know, list experiments where they sort of ask how many of these total do you agree with so that the experimenter doesn't know precisely what sort of sensitive beliefs you're expressing are a good way of doing this, but also in ways that I don't really have time to go into are better suited for measuring sort of mild racism than strong racism. Open-ended responses are sort of a nice way of trying to capture how it is that people think about these things, but the responses in surveys tend to be very sparse. You just don't get very many words, they're not very meaty, and of course people have sort of social pressures against sort of expressing sort of really bad words and these sorts of things. More recently, there's been sort of this ascent of man scale that's been developed as a way of trying to measure in a way that doesn't actually use you know, direct linguistic responses as to, you know, where do you position each of these groups, each of, you know, black people, Muslims, whatever, on this spectrum, where they give them a little slider for like saying where do they prefer to position people. And of course, this slider is completely pseudoscience anyway, but you know, people sort of have beliefs about that. And the drawback of that is that you tend to get results like this one, which, you know, it's mixing racism and just, I think, thermometer stuff, because, you know, yeah, we have white people here, we have black people here, but, you know, we have, what do we have, Democrats, journalists, feminists, Hillary Clinton, right? So these people probably don't really believe that these things are like more, you know, de-evolved. They're just using this as kind of a thermometer measure in various ways, and this is taken from a recent paper by Fortune Catelli, who's responsible for this thing. Okay, so why are we using social media? Well, you know, it's important in its own right, and it's this really great window into these complex, ill-measured, deliberately elusive opinion change things, right? So we've got, for people on social media, like an amazing record of their sort of beliefs and expressions over time, and we're really interested in the over time aspect of this thing, if we can figure out how to use this data in a way that can sort of illuminate these things. All right, so our research plan, originally it was sort of like, here's our theory. We have this theory that there's sort of soft or cultural racism on the one hand and like hard biological dehumanizing racism on the other hand. These two things are obviously correlated with each other, but they are different conceptual ways of framing racism. And what we're going to do is like try to figure out, you know, how people go from the first to the second. Our theory was that you start out as sort of a mild bigot, and then something or other changes in your circumstances, which definitely does not hold for everybody, that leads certain people to sort of graduate from the first to the second. And so the goal will be, okay, let's measure individuals on both of these dimensions, and then see whether our theory is sort of validated, that people sort of move in the way that we expect. You know, the reality is that when you start looking at this stuff, and this is kind of the advantage of taking this kind of open-ended textual approach that I'm going to be describing, you know, the world of hate is very complex, and the thing that was most striking to us and to other people who have done this is that misogyny in particular is just imbricated in all forms of racism. It turns up in a way that other forms of bigotry really don't necessarily interpenetrate with each other, but misogyny is kind of everywhere. So we had to sort of expand the ambit of this a little bit to include misogyny, and I'll touch on that a little bit at the end. And therefore, these trajectories are much more than just sort of this to this, but we have to sort of, we're sort of forced into a more complex measure of what's going on in these, the minds and the behaviors of these folks. All right, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the theory that I just described, but there's like a small sort of formal theory here where you have like a consumption benefit to hate. You like hating, you get enjoyment out of hate. The analog I use for this is like appetite. you have an appetite for a certain amount of food, you have capacity R, you get different benefits from hard racism and soft racism. Think of this as like dinner and dessert. You maybe get more benefit from dessert than for dinner, but you're sort of constrained in various ways that you can't just say, I'll have 3 slices of cake and a salad for dinner, right? There's sort of social constraints or psychological constraints that say that for these folks, they might get more benefit out of expressing hard racism, they might enjoy it more, but there are sort of social stigmas against using the N-word and other things like that. So they will sort of, when those stigmas exist, use a little bit more of the soft bigotry. This is just like a way of trying to put our description of like, why do soft bigots not become hard bigots in many cases? It's because they have this social constraint. But in the social media world and in the human world, you select your social group, and as you sort of move higher into hate, you might select a group that is less stigmatizing of the hard hate. So we've got a little model, which I don't have really time to go into. The net result is that if you imagine sort of soft hate on this side and hard hate on this side, then when the social cost of the hard hate is high, you sort of mainly specialize in soft hate. As the cost of the hard hate goes down, as your social group sort of changes, the stigma against using this sort of language shifts, you sort of increase in the amount of hard hate you can add into things. Eventually, you sort of end up on this Pareto frontier, the red curve of like any mix of these two things will sort of satisfy your total appetite. And slightly more optimistically, we imagine that for at least some of these people, eventually their interests shift to other things, and then their total appetite goes down, which sort of brings them back towards the origin. So if we sort of describe this curve, we have this kind of clockwise procession for these people, for those people who do engage in the hard stuff, which we would imagine being sort of at some point in their career somewhere around here, we would imagine that they sort of come in this way and then they depart that way. We don't really have a theory for what happens to the people who are like engaged in much more hard hate than soft hate, but we'll measure that too. Okay, so I'm going to go really fast through our sampling strategy here. We do 2 things. We sample people who follow a lot of white nationalists, or at least follow the same people that white nationalists follow. And we also subsample on people who use a lot of hate language. So it's the intersection of these 2 things. People who are sort of connected to racists and who have used lots of hateful language at some point in their careers. I don't want to go through the numbers of how we do the sampling, but it's basically sort of stepping out to the leaders and then stepping back to the followers of those leaders. And then we sort of filter that again on usage of terms from HateBase, which collects lots and lots of hate terms, many of which you've never heard of. You'll see some here. Don't look them up if you don't know it. You're better off not knowing it. And we do some various filtering to have a nice collection of people who have used a lot of hate language at some point or other online. So this is not supposed to be a representative sample. This is a sample of convenience of people who we know are strongly racist or hateful at some point, and we have a very good record of what they've been doing on Twitter for a long period of time. All right, so again, running a little short on time here. We end up having 1,000 users, each of them with between 1,000 and 3,000 tweets, stretching back different amounts of time. Twitter will give you at most 3,000 tweets on any individual if you ask for it at any given moment. So we get a very long timeline, although the timelines for each individual may differ depending on how frequently they produce these tweets. But it's very dense data for all these people, and it's sort of highly informative of what they're up to. But what they're up to, of course, is not just hate speech, right? These people are people on Twitter, we might call them hateful, but mostly they're just kind of engaged in politics like most people on Twitter. This is sort of what they're talking about in general. There's a lot of Trump, Obama, and Hillary. If you look further out, there's bad words in there, but to be honest, it's not all that different from what you would see from a random sample of Twitter, which is fairly profane itself. We can do topic models on this to try to figure out sort of what are these people talking about in general. Topic models are ways of finding clusters of words that tend to co-occur to get together. It's a way of sort of seeing, here are the different areas of interest that these people tend to cluster into. I don't have really time to go into the details of this. This is just a general descriptive thing. It's kind of analogous to the word cloud. Here are the sorts of things they talk about. Just sort of a coincidence that topic number 1 tends to be sort of foul language that's not actually ordered. So they talk about a bunch of different things. What we want is how to measure their racism both on the hard stuff and on the soft stuff. So one way we could do this is we could do a topic model just on the words from HateBase. That is, we can look at how do the various hateful words cluster, and then we could sort of describe people that way, or we could sort of do a sort of a general description of how people are talking about these things. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, we want a measure of soft racism, we want a measure of hard racism. So this is sort of general views on like how we could do that. One, we could categorize a bunch of tweets and then use that to code things. The second is we could just throw it into a topic model and pray. We're actually doing a sort of mix of these two where we subset some tweets and then use that to generate our measures. And again, this is sort of more on the computer science measurement side of things, so I'll skip over the details of that. All right, so as I said, the first thing we could do is we could just take the hate words and cluster them. So again, this is the beginning of the bad stuff. What's kind of nice about this is that you see fairly identifiable clusters of words, like they do have, times when they're doing Islamophobia, which interestingly is mixed in with homophobia for this particular group. If we had like a more detailed model, we'd probably be able to break those two things out. Racism, topic number 2, which is this thing. So these are words that tend to co-occur. Again, these are only bad words, so that's why it's such a terrible looking list of things. So topic number 2 would be like a good way of measuring racism, but the problem is even these people don't tend to use these words very often. So we need a bigger collection of words that tend to co-occur with these bad words here so that we can measure in a more nuanced way tweets of various sorts. We can look at sort of the trajectories over time of these folks. We see the spike in all sorts of hate speech in the 2016 election time period. The way to expand this is what we're going to do is we're going to take all the tweets that have at least one hate word in them and then cluster those so that we find the words that tend to co-occur with hate words. They have the hate words mixed in, but they're also words that aren't on the list that tend to go along with it. The nice thing about this is that we get like one topic that's sort of clearly on the misogyny side and another topic that's sort of clearly on the racism side. Both of these are very strong topics, which is to say if you use a lot of these words, you're probably a pretty hard racist. That actually works as a better model. When we track this, we get this very distinctive spike in the misogyny usage in the 2016 election in particular. So again, this is the first sign that like misogyny is really running a lot of this. We can do descriptions of individual people. So this is be like one person. They start out using more sort of misogynist language, and then later in the time period, sort of most recently, they've switched over to using more racist language. In this particular case, they're sort of switching from misogynist to Islamophobic language. So again, we can do individual descriptions of the proportions here. All right, so we're doing terribly on time here. So that becomes like a good measure of like how much hard racism you have. We also want like a measure of how much soft racism you have. When you're talking about race in a way that, is sort of cultural or historical, but not necessarily virulent. So instead what we do is we leverage the fact that these are all sort of people who are engaged with racist leaders, and we just say, okay, what do they talk about when they talk about black or blacks? That is these words. We do a topic model on that, and what we find is that, topic number 4 kind of captures sort of a milder version of racism. Most of these people are, as what we would characterize as bigoted in various ways when talking about race. So when they are talking about race, that tends to be bigoted. So this gives us a nice set of words that tend to be associated with sort of soft cultural racism. It's talking about the history of slavery in Africa and stuff like that, right? So they're not using the N-word, but they're definitely sort of engaged in sort of a milder racism. And so for every tweet now, we can sort of project it onto this hard racism measure and this soft racism measure and see for an individual sort of where they go in this space over time as they sort of develop their interests in racism. All right, so we don't have time for this, but we do the same thing for sexism and misogyny so that we can sort of compare the two results. So we have a soft and a hard measure for misogyny. Interestingly, misogyny is very different because, well, the racist language tends to be used about blacks in general. Misogynist language tends to be much more directed at specific politicians, particularly female Democrats. So it's tricky to sort of extricate these two things here, and we can talk more about that in Q&A if you want. All right, so we can look at these things here. So we have 2 measures of racism, 2 measures of misogyny. I'm going to sort of focus on the first pairing. Again, we have this theory of clockwise motion in this space. Here's the trajectories of like 2 individuals over their careers. They both start at about here. This one sort of comes back to sort of moderation, which is nice. This one sort of ends up very badly, which is to say they end up in sort of a lot of hard racism and not so much soft racism here. So, but on the other hand, they're very squiggly, right? So what can we say about individuals? Well, we need to pull them together and look at the aggregate trajectories of these people over time. So to do that, we could say, well, for each point in space, where do people go next? So we can say, well, like, what's the average vector at that particular spot? A person here, do they go this way? Do they go that way? Do they go that way? So we aggregate all these trajectories, we find this sort of space of arrows, and then we want to say, what's the flow in this space? We can have hypotheses, flow towards the middle, regression to the mean. Our theory, which is a kind of clockwise flow where, again, you go up and then over. We're not quite sure what's going on down here, but by symmetry, we suggest it's all going around. Or what I call the vortex of hate, which is the combination of the two, where they both have a clockwise motion and sort of an inwards regression to the mean motion. All right, so what's the result? What's the answer to this? If we look at the racism flow for everybody, we get this sort of crazy, beautiful graph, which I like the look of, but it's hard to see. If you zoom in, you can see that there's sort of flow here. Oops, that's not the same as what I'm seeing. All right, so PowerPoint won't let me zoom in. These are all little arrows, and you can sort of get the general gist of the flow. The question is then, statistically, what's going on here? What's the aggregate flow? So the way we do that is we sort of divide this up into quadrants to figure out the flow in each of the quadrants, and we can ask, and again, there's statistical tests on this, which way, if any, is all of this stuff flowing? Is it flowing clockwise, counterclockwise, neither? What we find is that if you're more soft than hard, or down here or over here, there tends to be sort of regression to the mean. But there's kind of this strong, everything sounds better with of hate on it. So this is like the jet stream of hate going on over here. We also have this clockwise motion, so it is kind of this vortex of hate where people are sort of coming over here, swooping over here. And in as much as they end up in the bad zone, they do tend to kind of regress back towards the mean. So it was actually surprisingly supportive of our theory, so much so that I was a little disappointed because it didn't really suggest new things. We do the same thing with misogyny, where we can have soft and hard, and actually we get the same pattern, which is kind of striking. We finally also combined misogyny and racism to ask, how do people flow between these two, because we saw so much connections between the two. So here's the plot. Which way do you think the flow goes, right? Ask yourself. The answer is this way, from racism to misogyny, and we don't really have like a good theory for that. I actually assumed it would go the other way because misogyny is so much more common than racism, but the answer is no, it actually flows that way. So we've got support for a theory, but then when we get into this multidimensional space, it becomes much harder to figure out what's going on. Okay, so it supports our clockwise theory for whatever that's worth. The soft-hard misogyny may operate like the soft-hard racism, but this misogynist language, which I haven't gone into too much, is deployed very differently. And this seems to be this evolution from hard racism into misogyny. So it may in fact be that this general tendency of the hard racists to sort of decline in the end may just be that they're shifting over to being misogynists. We have to sort of explore that for those people, because it's not necessarily the case that they're just becoming better people. Maybe they're just finding other groups that they prefer to hate more. And all these things are deeply connected. And this is slightly optimistic because opinion does change, albeit for this group badly, but for those of us who want to sort of persuade or nudge, the fact that there's so much shifting over time sort of can give us hope that we can tailor our interventions and intervene in the flow to nudge it. And the social media provides this sort of unique perspective, even if it is sort of observational rather than survey data, of like getting these dense, complicated, and sort of informative measures of hate belief. All right, thank you.
This is the trajectory, one we just heard. Great, going beyond surveys for studying public opinion. So I'm on board. 2, what the heck do you learn from topic modeling? I find it very hard to understand how to map what you get results from topic modeling onto anything having to do with the real world. I feel like you're kind of speaking to the topic modelers, and that's a problem. Number 3, and again, I'm being really quick. Number 3, we have this rarity problem. Less than 1% of people who, in the sample, who have some sort of hate tweet, less than 1% of their tweets have a hate word in them. And so that led me to think about alternative ways to design the sample and the analysis. In brief, I'm borrowing from King Coin Verba's Designing Social Inquiry, how do you sample rare events? It's a real problem for comparativists who are working with a small number of cases and don't want to end up having no variation on things. I think what you can do is sample specifically racist tweets, then secondarily sample specifically misogynist tweets, and have those 2 samples and start to ask to what extent you find the same tweeter in both of them, to what extent does one come before the other when you do have someone who's got both of them, and so on. Ditto, the same kind of strategy for hard-soft. Sample hard, sample soft, and then perform that kind of analysis. The logic is a very similar logic to the logic laid out in KKV. But finally, I really like the idea of the dynamics, and so that's a really important to keep. The jet stream of increasing hate is a term in the paper that was really compelling. Paper number 2, the Petersen paper, The Need for Chaos. Number 1, paper's 80 pages, and that's too long, and 40 is supplemental appendix, but I wanted to read that, so this has to be cut down. Number 2, there's a real question about whether this behavior is expressive behavior as opposed to actual behavior. So we have a measure of willingness, intention to share a tweet, but do they actually do it? And I think that just has to be addressed. Number 3, need for chaos, cool, interesting, but a lot of work needs to be done to see if it's really a trait like need for cognition and need to evaluate and the other need fors that we have in the literature. I worry that it might be more state-like than trait-like, that it's not this kind of stable disposition, but it's very fluctuating and pliable. I think that clearly a more transitory experience of anger is related to what you're studying, and in fact, I expect as anger rises, maybe the scores on need for chaos might move accordingly. So some attention needs to be given to that. There's and if that's true, if there's any chance that's true, then there's a question, then there's a concern about how you design your study, because if you could give these people these rumors, it makes them furious. Then they express need for a higher need for chaos, and then so on and so forth. So that there could be a sequence that's playing out in the course of your study because you start with giving people these hateful rumors that could piss them off. Then they respond to your need for chaos study scale and so on. And finally, there's this concept of violent action, support for violent action. And I don't have a lot of time, but the measure, this needs more conceptualization. It's very interesting. The measure says, think about the group that you care about most, and if you found your group under attack, would you go, would you engage in violent action 1 through 15? So it's a very group-centric idea, but at the same time, the whole concept of the paper is that these people are not group-centric. They hate everybody. And so there's a sort of a real tension between this notion that these are people who at one time are so committed to their own group that they're going to engage in a lot of violent behavior. At the same time, they want to burn the world down, and they tweet everything. They hate everybody. And I think there's a tension there that needs to be resolved, and I'm done.